All right, let's get started. Page layout and composition. We are in week 3. We're almost halfway there. We're almost halfway through this course. As a reminder, it's week 3. So if you missed week 1, please make sure you go back, watch the recording for week 1, send me a summary of what you learned or found interesting, and then you will receive full credit for week 1. If you're watching this recording because you couldn't attend week 3, again, please make sure you go back, watch this recording all the way through, and then send me a summary of what you found interesting and what you learned. And then you'll receive full credit. You can send those summaries to me via email or inbox. And then also our next live event, we have live events morning and evening, but we will have our next set of live events. We will have them in week 5 and week 7. So again, we only have 2 more days of live events, 2 more weeks of live events, I should say. So please make sure that you are staying on top of them. If you can't attend, that's totally fine. Just make sure you watch the recording, send me the summary, because that's the only way you will receive credit if you're not able to attend. But let's get started. Let's get into it. Oh, yes, another reminder, please make sure you're reading through each week's overview. Every week you have a weekly overview. That is basically a mini lecture in itself. It goes through just different information that you might need to help you with different things within that actual week. Also, you'll find links within those weekly overviews. That's a link that'll send you to videos that'll actually help you to do certain things in InDesign. So for instance, in week 2, there's a link to a video on how to add grids and how to use grids within InDesign. That's going to be super helpful, and that's helpful going forward and making sure that you are utilizing grids within your design. So please make sure you're reading through each weekly overview to make sure you have all the information you need in order to produce some really great designs for your assignments. Now, for this week though, or for this lecture, I should say, we're going to be going over visual balance. We're going to talk about symmetry versus asymmetry versus radial. And then after we are done talking about visual balance, I will go and open up InDesign and I'll show you how to do a bunch of stuff. I'll go through how to add grids and guidelines again. I'm actually going to show you how to design across a spread, because that is what you're going to be needing to do this week. We'll talk a little bit about typography, different things that you should be focusing on. And then I'll also show you how to export spreads in InDesign so that you can export them correctly. So let's get into it. So first up, visual balance. Visual balance, so incredibly important. Visual balance. So visual balance is basically the distribution of all the different elements within your page, but distributing them proportionately, right? Positioning all the different elements and proportion of elements in a way that just is as even as possible, really distributing that visual weight as evenly as possible. So when I talk about visual weight, it's basically the lightness or heaviness of an element, whether that's because of the color, the shape, the form, whatever it is, it's the heaviness of it, maybe how much space it takes up, how thick it is, the color that it is. Whatever that is, everything has a visual weight. All the elements on a page have a visual weight. To have visual balance, you need to make sure you're distributing that visual weight as evenly as possible. So think about the top, the bottom, the left, the right of the actual design. What are you putting at the top versus what are you putting at the bottom? What are you putting on the left versus what are you putting on the right? It should be evenly distributed regardless. That way, the overall design looks and feels stable. It's huge. When something isn't visually balanced, it doesn't look or feel stable. It could be very overwhelming or very underwhelming to the point where the person that's looking at it leaves. They stop looking at it and they aren't able to understand or take in that message that you're trying to communicate with them. Now, when you're looking at the elements, you can balance everything by size, complexity, color, or direction. Regardless, you need to look at these elements again as having visual weight, making sure you're distributing it as evenly as possible. When we look at this example here, it's a little blurry, but that's okay. Because again, that'll help you to look at these elements based on visual weight and not specifically what they say. So when we look at these examples, right, we have everything has a visual weight, the title, the subhead, the actual copy, right, the actual body copy, and the graphic or the image itself, all of that has visual weight. You need to distribute all of that as evenly as possible. The example on the left, it's not evenly distributed. If anything, it's all pushed up into this top area, right? That's all pushed up here. Everything is pointing this way. Everything is pushed all into this top left area, leaving all of this super empty, right? And because of size, because they just decided to center this is a little tiny thing right there in the middle. Because of that, because of all this white space or negative space that's being left, this overall design isn't visually balanced. It's very almost top heavy. It's actually heavy on this side, right? On this corner is super duper heavy. Everything feels like it's going and almost leaning that way because none of the elements have been distributed proportionately or evenly throughout this design. Now, when we look at this design on the right, it is very well balanced. What's on there's stuff on the left, there's stuff on the right, there's stuff on the top, there's stuff on the bottom, and it takes up enough space. Now, not all the space. I don't want you to think that visually balanced means that you need to take up all the space. No, white space, negative space is good. We like that, but we want to make sure there's just enough of it, but not too much. This design actually accomplishes that, right? You have the white space here, you have white space here, you have white space here. That's good. There's enough of it where it gives the viewer time to rest their eyes, but there's not so much that it leaves open these huge gaps that would be distracting to the viewer. Instead, a lot space is filled up intentionally. That's a big thing, intentionally by these elements. That way, the overall design would be very visually balanced. Notice that the overall title, it was enlarged to take up more space, and the color was changed. It now has more weight to it. It has more visual weight, so that when you do put it on the top, it's a little heavier up there. But to balance it all out, that's where you distribute the body copy, right? You split it into two columns. That way you can kind of evenly place both the copy on both sides of this page. So again, it's as equal as possible. And then notice that the overall the graphic was increased. So again, it takes up a little bit more space, and that way it's heavier. And that way it balances out this this thick, large title. So the color, the thickness, and the size of of the title is balanced by the large graphic. And that's kind of how you should think about it. Okay, this is going to take up this much weight up here. How do I balance it down over at the bottom? This is going to take up this much space and visual weight here. How can I balance that out on this side without getting too close and without taking up too much space and leaving that white space for my viewer to help rest their eyes? And that's what this designer did. Notice too is that because they wanted to balance this out, they used color to do that. Again, they used color to kind of add more weight to the top. They used color to add a little bit more weight to the right side. And then there's color here that's adding some weight to this side as well. That's done intentionally in order to, again, visually distribute that visual weight of these different elements. Because you can also distribute weight by color, right? Not just by size and not just by thickness, but by color as well. And this design does a very good job of that. So again, visual balance, it's placing all of these different elements on the page in a way where it feels as even as possible, right? Again, things are taking up enough space. The color adds enough weight to it. You're not placing everything on one side of the page. You're not leaving all these big, huge gaps open. You're distributing and placing all of the elements intentionally so that your design just feels and looks stable. To do that, right, to increase visual balance, you do need to know kind of how to kind of place your elements, and you could do that in a symmetrical way, an asymmetrical way, or a radial way. Now, symmetrical, right? Symmetry, we know that it's the visual quality of repeating parts of an image across an axis or along the path, right? You're repeating it. So if you were to draw a line down the center, what's on the one side is on the other side. What's on the top is on the bottom. It doesn't matter, but you're repeating different parts. There's a repetitiveness to how you're laying it out and how much space it takes up. Asymmetry is there's no rhyme or reason, right? Things are what's on the left does not look like what's on the right. What's on the top does not look like what's on the bottom. But regardless if they're symmetrical or asymmetrical, they can still have balance. Asymmetrical things can still have balance. Just because you put this image at the bottom does not mean you have to put an image at the top. Right? You have the title at the top and a graphic at the bottom. That's asymmetrical. They're not the same thing. Just because you put a column on the left side and a column on the right side doesn't mean they're symmetrical in the sense like this column could be longer than this column and you're just filling up the rest of the space with a graphic, right? So that can still have good balance even though it's not perfectly symmetrical, and that's important to remember. Now, radial, this is something that I think we forget about, is that radial relates to elements that spread around a central point. So again, you can have more of like a symmetrical radial type of design where everything is perfectly aligned in the center. And then you would just place all of your elements around that center versus more of like an asymmetrical type of radial design where the axis might be slightly slanted or it's not in the center of the page, it's off to the side, but regardless, the elements are still going around that central point, whether it's directly in the middle of the page or maybe off to one side. Notice here in this example, the example on the right is that this is a very well balanced design, even though all the shapes are different. And it's balanced because of the visual weight that's being taken up. So again, you have this big triangle. Well, it's being balanced by this very large rounded square, which is also being balanced by both this red oval and this smaller triangle. And that's also balanced on this side by this very large rectangle. All of that has visual weight and all of that's been distributed as even as possible in order to create a very well balanced design. Now, they're not all the same. Now, you know, right? The color is different. The spaces, I'm sorry, the color is different. The sizes are different and the overall shapes are different. But because this designer paired this oval with this triangle, the visual weights of each of those shapes equal about the same weight as these shapes individually. So again, when we are distributing our elements on a page, they don't have to all be the same. They can have different visual weights, but what we're pairing together and where we're placing them will create visual balance if we're doing it as evenly as possible. Now, moving forward, let's see if we can kind of figure out what type of overall layout or composition, right? How is this visually balanced, right? How are these actually created? We're going to look at different posters. Is this a symmetrical layout, an asymmetrical layout, or a radial layout? It is a symmetrical layout. So if you were to draw a line down the center, you'll see that what is on the left mirrors what's on the right. Obviously not perfectly, but in terms of visual balance and overall repeated types of imagery and types of graphics we see, it repeats. It's the same on both the left and the right. There's a face on the left, there's a face on the right. The title at the bottom extends perfectly centered, right? So that there's words on the right and there's words on the left and it's even. The hand that's there, right? The hand that's there, again, there's a little bit of the hand on the left, there's a little bit of hand on the right. You might say, oh, well, that thumb is there. That's throws it off balance. No, because of the way that the color is being used. You'll see is that there's more red on this side, right? That visually balances out that thumb that's over there. That's why it's so important to really take in, okay, what are the elements that I'm using? How can I place them on the page that creates visual balance, and really being intentional about how you're utilizing all those different things. The designer was intentional about where these little red flakes kind of went up. They made sure that there was a little bit more on this side because of how much space or weight that thumb has. But posters, that's not just the only place where you can see this type of layout. Again, we can see that in anything really, whether it's a poster, a flyer, a business card, or a logo itself. And we can see here that the Starbucks logo is perfectly symmetrical. Literally, if you were to select the left side, copy and paste it and flip it on the right side, it would perfectly match up. This is perfectly symmetrical. You can do that. If you are designing like a logo or something like that, you can work in a design that is perfectly symmetrical. And if you are working in a perfectly symmetrical design, it's going to have visual balance overall within the actual design itself. So know that you can also do that, but you're not limited to just doing that. Next up, what is this layout? Is it symmetrical, asymmetrical, or radial? I've stumped a few students with this one. It's radial. Now, if you were to put a point right at the center here, you will see that all the elements are being placed around the central point, right? That's in the very center of this poster. Notice too is the visual hierarchy that's being utilized within this design as well, right? All the elements that are available to this designer have been placed around the center, around the central point, but there's visual hierarchy based on the size of some of these elements. And that comes from the actor and how big that name is, right? Harrison Ford, huge at the top. He's a big name actor. It's somebody that they want people to notice that's in this film, regardless if they actually have a big role in this. They want to attract viewers, so they made sure that they took a high a big name, and they gave hierarchy to both his name by actually placing his name at the top, but also adding hierarchy to him by actually making him really big on the page. And then also Ryan Gosling as well. Again, he's also in the center. There's visual hierarchy being placed on him, not from his size, but the fact that he's, there's less around him. So your eyes are being drawn to him, and all of his body is basically being showed. He's also in the center of the page, not in the exact center, but he's actually centered on the page as well. His name is also included. That's done on purpose, where they're placed, the sizing, right? How much visual weight they take up. That's done on purpose in order to, one, balance this out, but also to communicate a message to the viewer. Now, like I said, these types of layouts can be found anywhere, not just in movie posters, even though movie posters are a really great example. You could also see them again in things like logos, flyers, wherever else. In this BP logo, you can see that the overall icon for this logo, not only is it like perfectly symmetrical, but again, it's also has a radial layout as well. Because if you notice these like little flowery type of graphics, they kind of center around a central point. Now, again, when you're designing, you don't have to put that central point in the actual center. You can put that central point anywhere on the page based on just what you're thinking, you want to do for the overall design. So again, if we look at this King Kong graphic, you'll see that the point is actually in the bottom, right? The point is down at the bottom right. That's where the central point is. And then now everything is being placed along that central point, right? You know, you see the actual name King Kong put somewhere near the center. That way it draws your eyes to this, or your eyes are already kind of going to the center. So the designer made sure they put their name there. And then again, based on, you know, visual hierarchy and the importance of certain characters, they enlarged some of these graphics. That way you would focus in on them and know that they play an important role, not just in the poster, but in the movie itself. You're communicating that message. So King Kong, the movie's named after him. He takes up the most space, but again, he's placed around that central point. And then again, you see these airplanes as well are placed around that central point, but they're smaller than King Kong himself because they're not the focus here. They're not the most important thing that they want to communicate. They want to communicate that this movie is about a gigantic gorilla, right? So they made sure that they put King Kong himself as big as possible. But notice that, again, that central point isn't in the very center. It's actually down to the bottom right, and that all the different graphical elements are placed around it. And what's even more interesting, even when you look at the background itself kind of goes along with that alignment as well, of having that diagonal. Not perfectly, but it does it in a way where it just enhances the overall message that's being communicated within this design. Oops. So next up, when we look at this poster, this isn't a movie poster. This is like an advertisement for a ice cream. But which is it? Symmetrical, asymmetrical, or radial? It's it's asymmetrical. Huh, I almost got it wrong myself. It is asymmetrical. If you were to draw a line down the middle, whether it's horizontally or vertically, whatever it is, horizontally or vertically, whatever it is, what's on the left is not going to be on the right. What's on the top is not going to match what's on the bottom. This is an asymmetrical design, or layout, I should say. It's an asymmetrical layout, but it still has really good visual balance because of how the elements were visually distributed and their overall positioning, right? Oops, their positioning. So this large dude at the very top, he takes up a lot of space and your eyes automatically go to him, which is done on purpose. They've added visual hierarchy so that you really take the time to look at this guy and really take in what he looks like. But the designer knows, oh, wait, I don't want them to get stuck there. I don't want them to get stuck at the top looking at the sky. So the way that they positioned him was not only to move your eye across to really take in different aspects of this person, but they made sure that they used an image where the hand kind of comes down, and they positioned it so that your eyes would start here, move across, and your eyes would work downward, following his arm. And then because you're ending up here, now you're taking in information about this ice cream cone and linking it back to the person that you just looked at. And because of the placement of this visual weight and also of this element itself, you are now looking at the text and you're reading the text. What a difference a taste makes. Again, because of the visual weight of this, paired with the overall weight of the arm with the ice cream, it is balanced, right? What's on the top and what's on the middle have similar visual weights, so it doesn't feel too necessarily heavy. This kind of does feel a little top heavy, but to continue to balance this out as much as possible, the designer didn't just stop there. The designer made sure that, hey, your eyes already, even though you might be reading this, your eyes are still going to be pointed downward, which brings you to the logo. And again, the size of the logo and the amount of space that it takes up and where it's actually placed was done intentionally to add a little bit, to add some visual weight to the bottom so that, again, it doesn't feel so top heavy. And also because of how all the elements are positioned, your eye is being led downward to actually look at the logo itself. But the designer isn't done yet. The designer decided, okay, not one, to highlight different aspects of this, of these elements, right? When you see this little glow around the ice cream, not only that, but they made sure that they placed this dark gradient area in the bottom left. They did that on purpose in order to add a little bit more weight to the bottom to try to visually balance out the overall design. That is done on purpose. That is done intentionally. So think about the visual weight as not just the elements that you're working with, but it could also be the background itself and the background texture or the background just color or both of how you can balance out an overall design, especially if you don't have a lot to work with and if you're working with some really complex elements, right? This person up here, very complex, got a lot going on. To visually balance it out, the designer had to really space out a lot of the different elements, being really intentional about where they're placing the elements, but then making sure that when they ran out of elements to place, that they worked with the background and added some texture to the background in order to, again, balance out that overall visual balance. And again, visual balance isn't just limited to posters. It can be used anywhere. And we can see here in this Nike logo, this is a very asymmetrical design. It is not the same on the left or the right or the top or the bottom. You can see that, you have a little bit of you have a big portion of the check mark with a couple of the letters, the rest of the letters, a little portion of the check mark. Now, this is an asymmetrical design, but it's still very balanced, right? You see big, thick letters with a thin part of the check mark, and then you see some thick letters, not as much of them, but with a larger part of that check mark. Again, there is still visual weight to this because it's as evenly as possible, right? As possible, not perfect. It's being distributed as evenly as possible. But in order to, again, distribute elements as evenly as possible so that this would have visual weight, notice that the little trademark symbols where they are, right? There's a trademark symbol right here next to the dip of the check mark, but then also there's one right next to the E. That's done on purpose for two reasons. The first reason is for visual balance, right? There is a thickness to this big to this part of the check mark. So placing this copyright symbol there actually adds some visual weight to that side, but then also placing this copyright as close to the check mark as possible kind of morphs it into the visual weight there so that it doesn't necessarily add on or takes away. It kind of just plays off of it. So again, it's as evenly as possible. The second reason why those copyright symbols are there is because Nike itself and the way that the typography and the name itself, that's copyrighted, but then also the check mark by itself is copyrighted. So in terms of branding purposes, you can't use them separately or together if you don't work for Nike. And that's done on purpose for branding. But the designer, knowing that they have to make sure those branding things are in there, made sure that they placed those copyright symbols in places where it made sense for the actual graphic, but then also worked well within the overall design, making sure that the logo was visually balanced. So I went the wrong way. But that's balance, that's visual balance, and looking at different layouts to enhance your overall visual balance. Let's get into InDesign so that I can show you some stuff. We're good on time. I'm going to stop sharing my screen just so I can do a new one. All right, so this is InDesign. I actually have open one of my original newsletter designs. That's what I'm designing. So that I can kind of show you guys how to create this and create your own newsletter with with a couple of other things in mind. Now, something to note, and this is a little cheat, right? A little cheat thing that you can do that I actually like to do this. Now, you should be working in spreads. That is how you should be creating your designs, in a spread format. Now, depending on how things are being printed, you could do it this way or not. And this is definitely up to you and how you like to work. This is how I like to work. And also, this is how I know this is going to be printed. So I am able to do this. So normally when you create a new document, right? You create a new document, you put how big you want it to be. Maybe you change the units, maybe the number of pages, right? But if you want those individual pages, right, to face each other to create that spread, you need to make sure you're checking off facing pages. Now, once you create that, you will create a document that has pages that face each other, meaning they link up right next to each other so that when you're designing across a spread rather than designing a page individually, right? So these are two individual pages, but if you look at it, I can design in a way where I can look at it like it's one big page rather than two individual pages. And that helps me to lay out all of my work in a way that lay out all the elements in a way where you can really create a cohesive design. Now, again, these are two individual pages. So if I were to move pages around, if I were to add more pages, that would definitely change up the way that this overall design looks and feels and where elements are, and things like that. But a way to get around that, especially if you know the kind of design you're working with for this newsletter, I know that, hey, if I were to get this printed, the cover and the front cover and the back cover, they're technically going to be printed on the same page. And the inside spread is going to be printed on the same page. And then you would just fold this in half to create the newsletter. I know this because I know it's going to be printed. So instead of creating individual pages, I can create this little cheat where I'm creating one page that is the size of two pages. So instead of creating an 8.5 by 11, I can create, it's a tabloid size. So instead of 8.5 by 11, I'm creating a 8.5 by 22. Wait, right? 22. Wait. 8.5 by, sorry. No. I'm creating 11 by 17. Sorry. I'm creating an 11 by 17 document rather than creating an 8.5 by 11 document because my document is 11 by 18. Let me get my my annotate tool out. Because my document is 11, right, by 18, right? Because that's how big it is. I can kind of cut it in half with my grids or my guidelines so that I can design pages to be, single pages, but I can do it in a way where I have access to this full spread design. And the way that I've done that is, again, I've sized this out to be one page that would be the size of two pages. And using my grids and guidelines, I've been able to create a page. This is what my grid looks like. I've been able to cut it in half by using my grids and guidelines. So again, utilizing these guidelines, right? This guideline right here, and lining it up right where the 8.5 and 11 mark would be, or 8.5 would be. I can cut this, I can kind of segment this page where I can have my right page and my left page, right, and distinguish it between each other so that when I do start adding in my elements, I know what is technically going to be going on the one page versus the other page, but I also have this really nice big area that I can design across rather than designing a page individually. I'm going to see if I can bring up another one of my designs to show you guys even more how that looks. Oh, this is just the cover. Sorry. Where is it? Where are my newsletters? Sorry, guys. I thought I saved it right here for you guys. Show you guys really quickly, and it's not here. All right, I'm just gonna move on because I had a year. I don't know what happened to it though. All right. All right. Back to this example, and I can always show you how to kind of design across the spread. So when you are designing, again, like I said, you could also do a little bit of a cheat, and because of this, you don't have to necessarily create individual pages. You can create one big page, cut it in half, and then just place all of your elements on either side to create the illusion that it's two different pages. So you could definitely do it that way, which might make it easier to design across a spread. So with that in mind, you could definitely realign and or I should say, you could definitely take your week 2, right? Your week 2, um, uh, not week 2, your the feature story that you created, and then also your infographic, and you can lay them out in a way that works with each other, because that's what the assignment is going to entail. You're going to have to take your week 2 assignments. You're not week 2, I keep saying week 2. You're gonna have to take your infographic and also your infographic and your feature story, and you're gonna have to create a spread with both of them in it so that it creates a cohesive design. And one way to create a cohesive design is to just break through each page. Instead of having the infographic just on one page and the feature story on just the other page, you can do it in a way where you can have them interact with each other across both spreads. So if you notice, I took my infographic and I broke it up. Instead of having it being displayed the way it originally was on the one page, I decided, well, let me, make it in a way where it works with the overall spread, it works with the overall design, and there's a cohesiveness where I can kind of connect one side to the other. And to make sure that everything stays well balanced, I'm still utilizing a grid. I'm making sure that my title falls within this smaller area. I'm making sure that my text aligns across this specific guideline that I've created. I'm making sure my boxes of imagery all line up fairly similar. I might need to adjust, right, based on the edges, but overall, everything is aligning nicely. And let's say I decided, you know what, I want to make this in this, this is somewhere close to the center. And now I can start taking my feature story and I can start putting it around this image to really showcase the fact that this is one cohesive spread. Do the stories relate to each other? They don't, but I can definitely utilize these spaces so that they can kind of work with each other rather than against each other. And if you're, and like I said before, you should really be deciding on what your overall grid looks like before you start designing. But if that's not the case, that's okay. You can still add in guidelines as you're working through your actual design, because you might say, you know what, I can't really get this to line up correctly. You can add in more. And if you can see, I'm starting to lay this out a little bit more. And again, you want to toggle between, your preview, um, your print preview, but then also you might want to toggle between, the print preview versus your design preview. And again, I'm making sure things are lining up correctly based on my grids, based on where some of these elements fall. I might be changing up maybe some of the colors, right, based on how this new, almost new design that I'm working with. I'm not completely changing everything, but I'm definitely editing it in a way that helps to really showcase the content and really showcase the different parts of this design, right? I'm taking what I've already done and I'm just almost relaying it out to make it better. So there you go. There is kind of how I'm starting to, make sure that this works well with the other designs. And I'm designing across a spread. Now that doesn't mean that I have to design across the spread. I can keep things on one side versus the other side. That's fine. But designing across a spread definitely helps you to connect both sides to each other, helping you to create more of a cohesive design. So there you go. This is what it looked like before, where I had everything on, one side versus the other side. Right? So this is what it looked like before I started to edit it. This is, everything was very much, this is on this side, this is on that side. But looking at it again and saying, hey, how can I make this design a little bit more cohesive and work better with each other? I relayed it out so that I have my infographic kind of going across the center. But then I also relayed out the overall design of one of the feature stories, or one of the stories that I actually have within the design itself as well, so that again there is some, again, there's cohesiveness, but again you can still see that these are two different stories. These are two different pieces to this newsletter that should be kind of read independently. And yeah, I'm using the screen a lot. And I think maybe to distinguish between the different stories or the different information that I'm providing, I can always change up the overall color of everything to really showcase the fact that, hey, this is something completely different, right? And don't be afraid to use those guidelines, right? To make sure that everything is lined up properly, right? That you're not too close to something versus another. Oops. But then also making sure everything is proportional, right? Everything's lined up as evenly as possible. So there you go. That's how I'm going to start. I'm starting to kind of design some of this to really help distinguish it between other elements. So again, I can showcase the fact that, hey, these are two different stories, but they work with each other rather than against each other. There you go. And then I can start bringing in maybe some of those other elements that I was working with, right? So I had that one story that was here, that was red. I might want to incorporate that. Again, I want everything to kind of work with each other. So maybe I want to bring in this feature story here, or this story, I should say, not necessarily a feature story. And then I want to make sure I'm aligning it based on some of these grid lines that I've put out here. I've already kind of added. Oops. Changing up some of the color just again so it works better. Again, I'm changing it. I don't want it to necessarily look like what I created before. I want there to be a difference because I want to show that these two different pages that I designed actually work really well with each other. They're not from two different publications. They're from one publication and they work well with each other. And notice how I'm toggling between the printed version versus, or the print preview versus like the design preview, because I think sometimes if we just work into one, it can get a little overwhelming to the eyes. But then when we work in the other, we might miss some things. So it's important to kind of say, hey, how can I work? How can I work between both to make sure I'm creating the best version, right? I also know too is that the numbers that you see here, yeah, there you go. The what you see here, the infographic actually connects really well to this story. So I want to connect them to each other to kind of say like, hey, they're with each other. But then I also want to make sure they still kind of can stand alone. That's why I'm changing up the way that you could overall view it, the overall visual elements that are represented. And again, this story down here still, it does a really good job of, yes, it relates back to maybe some of the information you see, but it's still a different story altogether. But notice too is that, again, because I want this to come off as a cohesive design, I'm also repeating some elements here. I'm repeating the fact that the opacity, right? The transparency of some of these images is very low, so you can see the color behind it. I'm repeating that in this story as well to relate back to some of these other features so that there is consistency in the way that I am designing. So that again, you can tell that, hey, they relate to each other, but they're still two different things. And now I'm bringing in this one. And remember, I have this center guideline here to help me to understand where the fold of the page would be. So if this would be printed, it'd be folded in half. And that gives me an idea of, okay, don't put my text too close to that line because then it could get folded over and become hard to read. So now I know not to do that. But again, right, this is an overall a way to lay out your designs so that they're both easy to understand. They relate back to each other. And as you're working through it, you might notice, more things. You might notice, you know what, I don't like that green box at the bottom. I feel like it makes it too bottom heavy, right? Because we talked about visual balance. Well, you can change it up, right? Change it up, make it slightly different so that, again, you can showcase the fact that, okay, I want to make sure this design has really good visual balance. So let me change up some of these elements in the way that I've displayed them so that they can still be easy to understand. And there you go. That's how I would try to visually balance this, right? It felt very bottom heavy because you had a lot of color and solid color at the bottom. So in order to break that up a little bit, instead of having that solid color, I gave it more of that white background that you see up here so that the images, again, everything would relate to each other in some way, but still be able to stand alone. So if you notice, like, okay, I can read this story, I can read this article and not get confused that it goes along with this article. I can read these two articles separately and know that this is another separate one as well. But at the same time, I can look at this infographic and really take in this information all at once, but excuse me, by itself, or I can read this and know that it relates to it in some way. And again, I'm designing across the spread in some areas, and in some areas, I'm not. I'm giving you that variety. So visually, it's interesting. But again, everything is organized in a way that you can easily understand what I'm doing and what I'm trying to communicate to you. And if you notice, I'm aligning things perfectly. I'm giving everything a really good solid edge, making sure that everything aligns correctly, right? Making sure that, if I'm ending something here, I'm ending everything along that same line. I'm utilizing my grids to line up and align different elements just to make sure everything, is as even as possible. I'm toggling between this preview mode and also this design mode. So again, I can see where things are working, what things need to be moved, right? If it is looking the way I'm thinking it's looking like, or if I need to change all of it up very quickly. So again, that is another way that you can think about this and design across a spread rather than trying to design things individually. And for your upcoming project where you're going to be designing a spread, it's important to not just place your infographic on one side and your feature story on another side. It's important for you to look at it as a puzzle. You're taking bits of this, you're taking bits of that, and you're kind of incorporating them across a spread to work with each other, but also still be able to stand alone if when your reader starts to actually go through and start taking in some of this information. So that's it. That's some grids. Some typography things as well. Notice that when I'm laying out my typography, notice the space between each box of text. Notice the space between. Notice how I'm trying to make it as even as possible, right? That's important to note because, right, and that might mean you may need to go in here and manually edit it, right? You need to manually change some things around. You might need to make some boxes bigger. You might need to make some boxes smaller. Regardless, you're making sure that each one of these typography boxes is being able, you can easily read it and easily understand it. Making sure that we don't have any of these little widows or orphans, right? Going through and taking care of those little things to, again, make sure that your overall design is clean and as easy to understand as possible. You might need to, again, um, change up the size of things, change up, how you're placing them, what you're actually highlighting. There might not, you might need to do a few things in order to make sure that your overall design is being displayed properly. And there you go. Other things to also think about is the overall typography that you're choosing. Notice that I don't have any really big decorative fonts anywhere. I could, right? Decorative fonts definitely work really well, but they really are only good for titles. Actually, decorative fonts are only good for titles, right? I shouldn't have them anywhere else but the title. Why? Because they can be really hard to read if you pair a decorative font with, they can be really hard to read when you use a decorative font in a in body copy, in large bodies of text. So it's important to know that, okay, if you want to use, if you want to use a, if you want to use a decorative font, you could definitely do that, but only use that for maybe the title. Don't overuse it and don't use it anywhere else, right? You should really only be using it for titles. When it comes to paragraphs, when it comes to, bodies of copy, you should be as boring and plain as possible. Really, body copy should only be done in either a sans serif or a serif font. I would even say a sans serif font, which is what you see here. Very basic, very plain looking in a lot of ways, but it's done on purpose so that your text can be easily read. Also notice the spacing I have between all of my lines of text, my leading, right? There's enough space between each line of text so that, again, I'm utilizing the space that I'm given by not having too much space or not enough space, right? Right? Because if there's not enough space, that's hard to read. If there's too much space, well, now you're adding in this really weird gap, right? By making sure you're working with your text to make sure that all the spaces is even and there's enough space, you can create a design, again, that's really easily understood and read, right? You're increasing that legibility and readability. Something else to note is to, I would always say add an extra space between each paragraphs. So like if you're breaking up the text, I add in an extra space, but then I just close up that space just a little bit so that, again, it's easier to read. You can break up the text again, so it's easier to read for the viewer, but then there's not these weird gaps of space. You can close them up a little bit more just so that it's the overall design is a little cleaner. And you would just, highlight your text, go through in your properties panel under the character panel. Obviously, you can change up the size, the leading. You can work with kerning. If you hover over each one of these for a little bit, a little picture, a little thing will pop up to tell you what it does. It's not doing it for me because I use this all the time. But yeah. And then, yeah, that's how I wanted to show you guys how to do that as well. What's good though, if you do my little cheat of when you're designing a spread, literally just making the page the size of what 2 pages would be, then you don't have to worry about exporting your spread. You don't have to worry about exporting your document as a spread. But if you were working with 2 individual pages, when you do go to export, you just need to make sure you click export as a spread rather than export as individual pages. To add crop marks and bleeds, which you will also have to do for your assignments, you need to make sure you're just checking off crop marks, and you to make sure that when it comes to bleed marks, you're making sure that you're editing it to be 0.25. You don't necessarily have to have bleed marks, just crop marks, and make sure that your bleed is 0.25. 0.25 is a standard bleed area. That way, your whoever's printing it has enough room to work with when they are printing it and chopping it down based on the crop marks that you have. So again, when you are exporting this, you want to make sure that if you are designing 2 individual pages, if you've done my cheat, you don't do this if you've done my little cheat of designing 1 big page. But if you're designing 2 individual pages together as a spread, make sure you're clicking export as spreads. And then also make sure you are selecting crop marks and making sure the bleed is set to 0.25. Once you've done those things, you can click export, and then it'll export your PDF in the way that you need to export it for your project, but then also it'll export it in a way that's really helpful for your printer if you're working with a printer. But that's it. That's everything that I kind of wanted to go over with you guys today. Sorry, that took a little longer, but I couldn't find one of my files that I was going to show you guys. Let me go back, and there you go. That's it. If you guys have questions, please feel free to reach out. Again, this week you're going to be designing across a spread. So you're going to be utilizing both the infographic that you created, but then also the feature story you laid out, and you're going to be putting them together to create one cohesive spread. Remember that piece, that spread you're creating, that's actually going to be a part of your final project. So keep that in mind about how you're going to be relating the cover to the inside spread, to the back cover, right? To create that final newsletter design. If you have questions about InDesign, if you're not sure how to do something, please feel free to ask me. I'll be more than happy to record myself doing something to show you how, or sending you a resource that'll help you to understand how to create something. If you're not sure about directions or what should be included, please let me know. You can text me, email me, or inbox me. I always suggest inboxing me. I feel like that's the easiest way to communicate with me. If you are watching this recording, please make sure you send me a summary of what you learned or found interesting so that you can receive full credit if you couldn't make it to either of the live events today. Don't forget about your Learn It. Start them as early as you possibly can in the week. Your yellow dig discussion, right? The initial post should be done by Wednesday. Your reply should be completed by Sunday, but there's only 2 people in this class, so you don't have to worry about replying. Just make sure you're just answering the discussion prompt. And also please make sure you are submitting your assignments on time. And if you're missing anything, please make sure you're submitting them as soon as possible. But that's it. That's everything. Please enjoy the rest of your day.